On Christmas Eve, I carried the handmade oak table I'd spent 3 weeks building into my living room and smiled. "Merry Christmas. I made this for your anniversary," I said. My daughter-in-law looked it over, shoved it onto the floor, and snapped, "This junk belongs in your garage." Then she slapped me across the face. I turned to my son, waiting for him to say something. He lowered his eyes and whispered, "Dad, please don't make this worse." I quietly nodded. By sunrise, I made one decision that changed all our lives forever. This one stays with you. Take a breath before we begin. Quick pause before we start. Drop a comment for me. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with family, yes or no? Your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Some details are fictionalized for storytelling. What matters is the lesson. I never imagined Christmas dinner would be the night a slap across my face would end 27 years of silence, or that watching my son stand frozen saying nothing would hurt more than the blow itself. The sound echoed through my living room, sharp and final. Simone's hand had already dropped by the time I registered the sting across my cheek. Around us, Christmas guests stood motionless wine glasses suspended mid-air. On the floor between us lay shattered pieces of the oak table and chair set I'd spent 3 weeks building handmade, hand-carved with their names along the legs. She'd thrown it to the ground like trash. I looked at my son. Glenn stood 6 feet away, eyes moving between his wife and me, mouth half open. I waited. The whole room waited. He said nothing. That silence, not the slap, not the shattered wood, was the thing that broke something inside me. But let me start 3 weeks earlier. Early November in Dublin. Ohio brings cold that settles into your bones if you're not moving. I was moving. At 69, I still had the rough, calloused hands of a man who'd spent 40 years building things, homes, furniture, trust, one careful piece at a time. That night, I stood in my garage under warm yellow light running a hand planer across white oak that would become the tabletop for my son's 5th wedding anniversary gift. The wood curled away in thin ribbons filling the air with sawdust and linseed oil. I'd already cut the legs, shaped the chairs, fitted the joints with the kind of precision that doesn't come from a manual. Along each table leg, I'd carved their names, Glenn and Simone, November 2022. 5th anniversary. You might wonder why a man spends 3 weeks building furniture for a son who barely calls. I wondered that myself sometimes late at night when the planer went quiet. But I kept working because that's what fathers do. Phyllis found me past midnight. She appeared in the doorway carrying 2 mugs of tea, her silver hair catching the light. Phyllis Mercer, 63. And wiser than I'd ever be, set 1 mug on the workbench and sat beside it, her eyes holding the kind of patience that came from watching her husband give too much for too long. "You're overworking yourself again," she said quietly. I didn't look up from the wood. "It's their 5th anniversary. I know. I want it to be perfect. It already is, Otis. It was perfect 2 days ago." I ran my thumb along the table edge, checking for roughness that wasn't there. Phyllis didn't argue. She just sat there on the workbench, keeping me company in the cold garage while I sanded the same piece for the 4th time. I didn't know this would be the last time I ever made woodwork for my son. Every Christmas before that one, I'd built something. A bookshelf when Glenn and Simone bought their first condo, the one I co-signed for because their credit wasn't quite enough. A dresser the year after. A hope chest I'd carved with careful detail, thinking maybe grandchildren would come. They never did. The chest sat in their guest room gathering dust, but I kept building because it was the only language I knew for love that didn't require saying the words out loud. How many hours does a father spend in silence building things for people who will never ask how long it took? I finished the anniversary set 3 days before Christmas. Phyllis helped me load it into the truck, and we set it up on the heated back patio where it would wait until Christmas Eve dinner. Under the tabletop, I'd glued a small brass plate made for my son's 5th anniversary. Hope they'll use it for many years. December 24th arrived with snow forecast, but not yet falling. By 3 in the afternoon, my house glowed with Christmas lights, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled every room. Phyllis had been cooking since dawn. I checked the patio heater twice, made sure the back door opened smoothly for when I'd bring everyone outside to see the gift. Glenn's car pulled into the driveway at 4:15. He stepped out first, my son, 42 years old, dressed in the kind of business casual that signaled middle management comfort. He walked up the path and hugged me briefly, his hand patting my shoulder twice before pulling away. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, son." But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted past me, scanning the doorway. Looking for her. Simone came next, stepping out carrying 3 shopping bags. Coach Nordstrom, something else I didn't recognize. Simone Mercer, 38, dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, swept through the front door with the practiced air of someone who'd never questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. "Otis," she said, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Lovely as always. Behind her came Vernon and Celeste Garrison, Simone's parents. Vernon, 67 and silver-templed, extended a firm handshake with the kind of smile that had closed 1,000 property deals without ever reaching his eyes. Celeste, 64, and dressed in seasonal cashmere, offered a polite nod while already scanning my Christmas decorations with an interior designer's critical eye. Phyllis greeted everyone warmly, taking coats, offering drinks, guiding people toward the living room where the tree stood surrounded by wrapped gifts. I watched Glenn's eyes drift back toward Simone after every interaction, after shaking my hand, after greeting Phyllis, after commenting on the decorations. Always checking. Always making sure she was still there, still approving. I had seen that look in my son's eyes many times over the past 10 years. Always watching her. Always measuring his words, his actions, his affection against whatever standard she'd set that day. Glenn hugged me that afternoon, but his eyes were already somewhere else. I watched him scan the room until he found her, Simone, standing by the tree, running one manicured finger along the edge of a hand-stitched ornament Phyllis had made. He smiled at her, not at me. I knew then, standing in my own living room, with the smell of Christmas dinner filling the air, that the table I'd spent 3 weeks building was already irrelevant. What I didn't know was that in less than 3 hours it would be in pieces on my floor. Dinner was winding down when I finally stood to bring in the gift. 3 weeks of work, 27 years of hope, all resting on a moment I thought would matter. Phyllis caught my eye as I excused myself from the table. She knew what I was doing. I walked through the kitchen to the back door, stepped onto the heated patio, where the oak table and chair set sat waiting under soft yellow light. The wood gleamed. I'd applied the final coat of finish 2 days earlier, and it had dried to a smooth, warm glow that seemed to catch the Christmas lights strung along the patio edge. I carried it inside carefully, one hand under the tabletop, the other gripping a chair. The set wasn't heavy, maybe 40 pounds total, but I moved slowly, aware that every eye in the living room had turned toward me. "Glenn, Simone," I said, setting the pieces down gently on the carpet between the sofa and the tree. "I made this for your 5th anniversary. Carved your names right here in the legs. Thought it might last you another 40 years. I pointed to the lettering along one table leg, Glenn and Simone, November 2022. The carving was clean, precise, the kind of detail that takes hours under lamplight, with hands that aren't as steady as they used to be. Glenn stood stepping closer. His face held something I couldn't quite read, surprise maybe, or uncertainty. "Dad, you didn't have to..." Simone cut him off. She'd risen from the couch and was standing over the table, arms crossed, her expression flat. "It's handmade," she said. "Not a question. Not gratitude. Just a statement delivered with the kind of tone you'd use to identify something you'd found in the trash. Why do we hope for gratitude from people who have never learned to notice what we give? I straightened, keeping my voice steady. Yes, I built it myself. White oak. The joints are mortise and tenon, no screws, no nails. It'll outlast anything you could buy in a store. Simone picked up one of the chairs, turned it over once, examining the underside like she was checking for defects. Then she set it down and looked at me with something close to pity. This kind of handicraft belongs in a garage, not our apartment, she said. We have a modern aesthetic. This is rustic. The word landed like an insult. I heard Vernon shift in his seat behind me. Celeste made a small noise that might have been disapproval, though I couldn't tell whether it was directed at me or her daughter. Glenn stood frozen between us, his mouth slightly open, saying nothing. I took a slow breath, feeling the warmth from the fireplace against my back, the smell of pine and cinnamon still hanging in the air from dinner. "Sir, I made this with all my heart," I said quietly. "If you don't like it, just put it away. But please respect the effort." Simone's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "No, don't lecture me in front of my parents." Then she slapped me. The sound cracked through the room, sharp and final, echoing off the walls and the high ceiling. My head snapped to the side. I felt the sting spread across my cheek, felt the heat rising where her palm had connected with my face. Somewhere behind me, I heard Phyllis gasp. A wine glass clinked as someone set it down too hard. I didn't move, didn't raise my hand to my face, didn't speak. The slap didn't hurt. Not physically. I am 69 years old. I've had worse. But the silence that followed, that broke something no woodworker's glue could ever fix. I didn't look at her. I looked at my son. Glenn stood 6 feet away, his face, pale eyes moving between his wife and me, like he was watching a car accident and couldn't decide which direction to run. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. I waited. The whole room waited. Phyllis stood near the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed to her chest. Vernon had risen from his chair, his diplomat's smile finally gone, replaced by something uncomfortable. Celeste stared at her daughter with an expression I couldn't read. And Glenn, my son, my only child, the boy I'd spent 42 years loving in the only language I knew, Glenn said nothing. The seconds stretched. 5, 10, 15. Finally he spoke. "Dad." His voice came out hoarse, uncertain. "Please don't make this worse." Not one word to Simone. No demand for an apology. No acknowledgement that his wife had just struck his father in his own home on Christmas Eve. Just a plea for me to be quiet, to let it go, to make it easier for him, by disappearing into the background where I'd always been. That was not the statement of a man choosing a side. It was the statement of a man choosing to stand nowhere. And that is far worse. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my ribs, not my heart, but something deeper. The invisible scaffolding I'd built around my son for 27 years. The hope that one day he'd see what I'd given, that one day he'd understand it all, collapsed in that moment, turning to dust between us. Phyllis moved before I could. She crossed the room in 4 steps, placed herself between me and Simone, and looked directly at Glenn with the kind of steady fury I'd only seen twice in 30 years of marriage. But my husband's kindness was a gift. She said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. You treated it as an obligation. From today on, go carry your own lives. Vernon started toward us, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Let's all calm down and... Out! Phyllis said, cutting him off. Now! She pointed to the front door. No one moved for a moment. Then Vernon reached for his coat. Celeste followed. Simone grabbed her shopping bags without looking at me, her face set in a mask of cold indifference. Glenn hesitated, his eyes finally meeting mine. I saw nothing there I recognized. He picked up his coat and followed his wife to the door. No apology, no explanation, no backward glance. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded in that moment like the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I walked to the window and watched my son's taillights fade into the falling snow. Phyllis placed her hand on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to say anything at all. The silence said everything that 27 years of sacrifice never could. By morning, I would make a decision I'd never made in my entire life, to do nothing at all. The phone started buzzing at 6:30 on Christmas morning, and I made a decision I'd never made in 69 years. I did nothing. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee watching the screen light up. Glenn's name appeared first. The phone vibrated 3 times, then went silent. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again. Simone this time. Then Vernon. Then a number I didn't recognize, probably Celeste calling from a backup phone, thinking I'd blocked the others already. She was right. I picked up the phone, opened my contacts, and scrolled to Glenn's name. My thumb hovered over the screen for maybe 5 seconds. Then I tapped the button. Block contact. Confirm. 1 tap. That was all it took. I did the same for Simone, then Vernon, then Celeste. 4 names, 4 taps, 27 years erased in under a minute. I didn't throw the phone, didn't curse, didn't call back to yell or explain or demand the apology I knew would never come. I just tapped, once for each name. That was all it took to end 27 years. Phyllis appeared in the doorway wearing her robe, her silver hair still uncombed from sleep. She looked at me, then at the phone in my hand, then back at my face. She said nothing. She crossed to the counter, picked up the coffee pot, and refilled my mug even though it was still 3/4 full. Then she sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. We sat like that for maybe 10 minutes. The only sound was the furnace clicking on warm air, pushing through the vents and the faint hum of the refrigerator. "You okay?" she finally asked. I looked at my coffee. Steam rising in thin curls. Christmas morning light filtering through the window, turning everything soft and gray. "I don't know yet," I said. She nodded, like that was the most reasonable answer in the world. "You might think blocking your own son is cruel. Maybe it is. But I had been kind for 27 years, and kindness without boundaries is just another word for doormat. I'd opened every door, answered every call, fixed every problem before he even knew it existed. And on Christmas Eve, when his wife slapped me across the face in my own living room, he'd stood there and told me not to make it worse. I was done making things better for people who didn't notice I was doing it. Glenn came to the house the next day. I was in the garage when I heard the car pull into the driveway. I looked through the small window near the workbench and saw him step out, pull his coat tighter against the cold, and walk up to the front gate. He stopped there, of course he stopped there. I'd locked it the night before. He rang the doorbell, waited, rang it again. "Daddy tum?" His voice carried through the glass, muffled but clear. "Dad, please, I just want to talk." I stood in the garage, one hand resting on the workbench, and watched him through the window. Phyllis appeared beside me a moment later, arms crossed, saying nothing, just standing there in case I needed her. Glenn knocked on the gate. Louder this time. "Dad, come on, open the door." I didn't move. Every time he knocked, I wanted to open that door. Every single time. But wanting something and doing it are not the same thing. I'd wanted my son to see me for 42 years. I'd wanted him to notice the bookshelf I built, the dresser I sanded, the co-signed mortgage that kept him from losing his condo when his credit wasn't good enough. I'd wanted him to say thank you just once without Simone standing behind him telling him what to think. Wanting doesn't make it happen. Phyllis reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," she whispered. Glenn stood outside for 20 minutes that first day. I watched his breath turn to white fog in the December cold. Watched him pull out his phone, stare at it, then put it back in his pocket when the call didn't go through. Watched him finally walk back to his car, shoulders hunched, and drive away. He came back the next day, and the day after that. What happens when you open a door to someone who has never learned to knock with respect? Each time I stayed inside, each time Phyllis stayed beside me. She never asked if I was sure, never suggested I reconsider. She just sat with me on the couch near the window, holding my hand, while my son stood outside calling for me like a child locked out of the house. But he wasn't a child. He was 42 years old. And this was the first time in his life he'd ever had to wait for something he couldn't control. By December 30th, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that turns your breath to ice crystals, that makes your lungs burn if you're outside too long. I was standing at the window when Glenn's car pulled up again, late afternoon, the sky already going dark. He got out, walked to the gate, and knocked. "Dad, please!" I could see him stamping his feet, pulling his coat tighter, his bare hands already red from the cold. He should have worn gloves, should have worn a hat, should have checked the weather before driving all the way out here in the middle of a cold snap to stand outside a locked gate. But he didn't. He stood there for 15 minutes, in 12-degree cold, breath coming out in thick clouds, stamping his feet to keep the circulation going. Finally, he walked back to his car and drove away. I thought, this is the first time in his life he is truly feeling cold. Not the temperature, the absence of someone rushing to save him from it. For 42 years, every door had opened for him because I was on the other side making sure it did. Every problem disappeared before it became uncomfortable. Every consequence softened before it could leave a mark. Now he stood outside in the bitter cold, and no one came. I watched his taillights disappear down the street. Phyllis came up behind me, rested her hand on my shoulder. "You doing okay?" she asked. I turned away from the window. "I think," I said slowly, "I might be." By the new year, I would discover something even stranger, what it felt like to live for myself. On the third morning after I blocked my son's number, Phyllis and I went out for breakfast, and for the first time in 27 years, I didn't check my phone once. We drove to a small diner on Bridge Street in Dublin, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone honey. Phyllis ordered French toast. I ordered pancakes with bacon, and when they arrived, steaming hot with butter melting into the ridges, I realized I couldn't remember the last time we'd done this. Just sat across from each other over breakfast without me thinking about what needed fixing at Glenn's house, or whether his furnace was running properly, or if the walkway ice had been salted before Simone left for work. "When was the last time we did this?" Phyllis asked, echoing my thoughts. I cut into the pancakes, watching syrup pool in the center. "I honestly can't remember." "Me neither." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held sadness around the edges. "You look lighter. Not happy yet, but lighter." I thought about that word. Lighter. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long, I'd stopped noticing the weight. And now that it was gone, I kept expecting to feel it pressing down on my shoulders. After breakfast, we walked through Kaufman Park. Snow covered everything in clean white drifts, the bare trees stark against the gray January sky. Phyllis pointed out cardinals perched in the branches, bright red against the winter landscape. We walked slowly, our breath turning to fog, our boots crunching through fresh powder. Freedom, I discovered, doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with pancakes you didn't have to rush through, and a walk you didn't have to cut short. I'd spent 27 years checking my watch during moments like this, calculating whether I had time to finish the walk before Glenn might call about a leaky faucet, or Simone might need help moving furniture. Now I walked as long as Phyllis wanted, and when we finally headed back to the car, my phone sat silent in my pocket. No missed calls, no voicemails, no emergencies that required dropping everything to fix someone else's problem. The sensation was both liberating and disorienting. Like learning to walk without a limp you'd had so long you'd forgotten what normal felt like. That evening I went out to the garage. I turned on the space heater, let it warm the air while I pulled out a piece of cherry wood I'd been saving for no particular reason. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling the grain beneath my palm, and decided to make a small box. No recipient in mind. No anniversary to commemorate. No careful carving of names into hidden corners. Just a box. I chose cherry wood because I liked the way it caught the light. That was the only reason I needed. When was the last time you made something for no one but yourself? Not for a birthday. Not for duty? Just because your hands wanted to shape wood, and that was reason enough. I spent 2 evenings on it between the end of December and the start of the new year. Measured the pieces. Cut the dovetail joints with the kind of precision that comes from 4 decades of practice. Sanded the corners until they were smooth as glass. Applied 3 coats of finish, waiting between each one for the wood to absorb the oil and glow. No name to carve into it. No delivery date. No one waiting for it. It was the first time in 27 years I made something simply because I wanted to. Phyllis came out on the second evening, brought me tea, and sat on the workbench watching me fit the final corner together. "What's it for?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "Just wanted to make it." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. The blizzard hit on January 4th. I woke at dawn to 12 inches of fresh snow blanketing everything in sight. The weather report said temperatures had dropped to negative 12 degrees overnight, with wind chills pushing it even lower. I drank my coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the world turn white and silent. By 8 o'clock, I'd cleared my own driveway. Just mine. Not Glenn's. Not anyone else's. I came back inside, stomped the snow off my boots, and poured a second cup of coffee. Around noon, my neighbor knocked on the door. Brent Townsend, the 51-year-old history teacher from next door, waved from the porch with the easy familiarity of 15 years of neighborly snow shoveling and borrowed tools. I let him in, and he stamped his feet on the mat, bringing the smell of cold air and snow with him. "Crazy storm," he said. "Schools are closed through Friday. Figured they would be." I handed him a mug of coffee without asking. He always took it black. He wrapped his hands around the mug, warming them. "Saw your son out at his place this morning. 6 a.m. Took him 2 hours to clear that driveway. Looked rough." I sipped my coffee, kept my face neutral. 12 inches is a lot of snow, I said. Brent nodded slowly, his eyes studying my face like he was reading a historical document and looking for the context between the lines. "Yeah," he said. "I remember you used to do that for him, didn't you?" "Every winter." He paused, took a drink of coffee. "Not anymore, I guess." "Not anymore," I agreed. What I didn't tell Brent, what I'd never told anyone, was that I used to clear Glenn's driveway at 5 in the morning, every time it snowed more than 3 inches. I'd wake before dawn, drive over in the dark shovel, and salt the whole thing before Simone left for work at 7:30. Glenn never knew because he was always still asleep. Simone never asked because she assumed the condo association did it, or maybe she just didn't think about who cleared 12 inches of snow before breakfast. Now Glenn was out there at 6 a.m., taking 2 hours to do what I used to finish in 45 minutes late for work, because invisible help doesn't announce itself until it stops showing up. I poured myself more coffee. Outside, the temperature had dropped to negative 12 degrees. For the first time in many years, I didn't have to worry about anyone else's driveway, only my own. Brent's words hung in the air. "Not anymore, I guess." What I didn't know yet was that Glenn had already begun to see me not in person, but in hundreds of silent clips recorded over years of invisible arrivals. I learned about what happened next from my son much later, the night in early January, when he accidentally opened his doorbell camera app and discovered a father he'd never truly seen. Glenn sat alone in his living room that evening, laptop glowing in the darkness, trying to troubleshoot a motion sensor issue with his doorbell camera. Simone had gone to bed hours earlier. The condo was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of wind rattling the windows. He clicked through settings looking for the sensitivity adjustment and accidentally opened the archive folder. The screen filled with thumbnails, hundreds of them, each one time-stamped and labeled motion-detected front door. He scrolled down. The dates went back years. He told me later that the first clip he clicked was from October 2021, 6:17 in the morning. The timestamp glowed in the corner. I was carrying my toolbox through light rain, my jacket dark with water, my breath visible in the cold morning air. He watched me work on his porch light for 12 minutes, replacing the fixture that had been flickering for weeks. Then watched me walk back to my truck and drive away. No knock, no text. Just fixed it and left. He clicked another clip. This one was dated December 2020, 5:48 in the morning. I was shoveling his driveway in the dark, my movements methodical and steady, clearing a path from the garage to the street before sunrise. He watched me finish, watched me toss salt across the walkway, watched me get back in my truck and disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. He whispered to himself, "How many?" Then he started scrolling. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from discovering you were loved all along. You just never bothered to notice. 437 clips. He told me later he counted them. 437 times I appeared on that camera over 6 years. 437 silent arrivals that he'd never seen because he'd never thought to look. He watched me walking his dog at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday because I knew he was working late and the animal needed exercise. Watched me replacing a porch bulb at dawn so Simone wouldn't have to drive to work in the dark. Watched me clearing ice from the steps in January so no one would slip. Watched me bringing covered dishes to the porch on Thursday nights when I knew they'd both been working long hours and might not have time to cook. Every clip showed the same pattern. I arrived. I worked. I left. No knock, no call, no waiting for thanks, just quiet maintenance of the invisible scaffolding that held his life together. How many times can a father arrive in the dark, fix what's broken, and leave before sunrise, and still believe his son will one day see him? Glenn sat there for 4 hours, unable to stop clicking through the archive. Each clip was short, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but together they told a story he'd somehow missed while living it. March 2019. I was on my hands and knees in his front garden at 6 in the morning, pulling weeds before they overtook the flower beds Simone had planted but never maintained. July 2020. I was power washing his siding on a Saturday afternoon while he was out erasing 3 years of grime and pollen. November 2021. I was replacing his mailbox post that had rotted at the base, digging a new hole, setting it in concrete, making sure it would last another 10 years. February 2022. I was salting his walkway at 5 in the morning after an ice storm, moving carefully in the darkness, making sure every inch was covered before Simone left for work. Every clip was time-stamped. Every clip was dated. Every clip was evidence of a presence Glenn had never registered because I'd made sure my help was invisible. He watched me carrying grocery bags to the porch during a blizzard when their street was impassable and deliveries had been canceled. Watched me fixing the downspout that had come loose in a windstorm. Watched me trimming the hedges, checking the furnace exhaust vent, replacing the doormat, tightening the porch railing. I was there. I was always there. And he never knew. This was the first time Glenn truly saw me, not in person, but in hundreds of silent arrivals that proved love had been there all along, invisible and patient. At 2 in the morning, he closed the laptop. The room fell into complete darkness. He sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he'd just seen settling over him, like the snow that had started falling outside his window. He picked up his phone, found my contact, pressed call. The line clicked once. Then an automated voice, pleasant and emotionless. "This number cannot be reached at this time." He pulled the phone away from his ear, stared at the screen, then tried again. Same message, same pleasant automated rejection. "This number cannot be reached at this time." He set the phone down on the coffee table, sat in the darkness of his living room in the middle of an Ohio winter, surrounded by the silence of a home he'd never truly maintained himself, feeling the absence of a father who had maintained it for him without ever asking to be seen. My son saw me in those videos, but I had been there without needing him to see. That is the difference between love and recognition. I don't know how long he sat there that night. I only know that when he finally told me about it, months later, he said that was the night he truly understood what loneliness meant. Not the absence of people around him, Simone was asleep in the next room, but the crushing realization that he had lost someone who had been present in ways he'd never bothered to notice. He was lonely, not because there was no one around him, but because he understood who he had managed to lose. My son sat in the darkness at 2 a.m, with a phone he couldn't use, and 437 videos he couldn't unsee. I wasn't there to witness it. But months later, he told me that was the night he finally understood the difference between being loved and deserving it. By the next morning, winter would arrive in earnest, and with it, the first real consequences of living without a father who had always been there. The furnace died at 2 a.m. on the coldest night of the year, and my son woke to a house already dropping below 50 degrees. Mid-January had brought a record cold snap to Ohio. Temperature plunging to -15 degrees. Wind chills pushing it even lower. Glenn told me later that he woke because he could see his breath in the bedroom white fog rising from his mouth in the darkness. He went downstairs, checked the thermostat. It read 48 degrees and dropping. The furnace in the basement sat completely silent. He called the emergency HVAC line at 2:30 in the morning. Got put on hold. Waited 15 minutes listening to recorded messages about high call volume due to extreme weather conditions. Finally reached a dispatcher who told him the earliest they could get someone out was 8 a.m. And it was Martin Luther King Day weekend, so emergency rates applied. How much? Glenn asked. $2,800 just to come out on the holiday, the voice on the phone said. Repairs on top of that. The emergency HVAC technician, a tired-looking man in his 50s, arrived at 8:15 and spent 20 minutes in the basement. He delivered the holiday weekend quote with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen this crisis 100 times before. Shokitisium. Ignition systems shot, he said. Burners are caked with carbon buildup, probably been neglected for a year or more. I can fix it, but with the emergency rate and parts you're looking at, another $1,600 on top of the service call. Glenn did the math. $4,400. He sat on the basement stairs in the cold, watching the technician work, and remembered something he'd never thought about before. Every October, like clockwork, I'd show up at his house with my toolbox, go down to the basement and spend an hour cleaning those burners, changing the filter, checking the ignition, making sure everything was ready for winter. How many times do you walk past the same maintenance work without noticing until the day it stops happening and everything breaks at once? Glenn signed the invoice. $4,400 on a credit card that was already carrying a balance from Christmas. I knew exactly why that furnace failed. I cleaned those burners for the last time in October 2022. This year, I wasn't there to do it anymore. 1 week later, the second polar vortex hit. Glenn woke at 6 in the morning to the sound of water rushing somewhere beneath him. Not the gentle sound of plumbing, the angry, pressurized sound of water going where it wasn't supposed to go. He ran down to the basement. 2 inches of water covered the concrete floor, spreading from a burst pipe along the back wall. The main supply line had frozen overnight and cracked clean through. Water sprayed from the break in a steady arc, adding more to the flood every second. What happens when the safety net you never knew existed simply vanishes one October morning? Glenn waded through the water looking for the shutoff valve. He'd never needed to find it before. Never thought about where it was. He checked behind the water heater, behind the furnace, along the wall near the stairs. 30 minutes later, soaking wet and freezing cold, he gave up and called an emergency plumber. The plumber arrived an hour later and shut off the water in 15 seconds. The main valve sat behind a storage shelf exactly where it had always been, with a bright yellow tag attached that read, "Main water shut off. Turn clockwise to close." I'd tagged that valve in 2018, bright yellow, with instructions, clear as day. No one had ever bothered to notice it was there. The emergency plumber surveyed the flooding basement with a slow shake of his head, already calculating the remediation costs, before Glenn could finish explaining what happened. $4,200 for the pipe replacement, he said, making notes on a tablet. Another $2,800 for water remediation and mold prevention. You let it run for 30 minutes. I couldn't find the shutoff, Glenn said quietly. The plumber pointed to the yellow tag without comment. You're looking at $7,000, give or take. Simone came down the stairs in her bathrobe, stepped into 2 inches of cold water, and looked around the basement like she'd walked into a nightmare. How did this even happen? She asked. Glenn didn't answer. He was staring at the yellow tag, reading my handwriting, understanding that I'd prepared for this exact emergency 5 years ago, and he'd never once thought to look. $4,400 for the furnace, $7,000 for the flooding, $11,400 in 2 weeks. Simone wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold basement air. Then she said it. Just call your dad, she said. He'll know what to do. Glenn stood there in 2 inches of water phone in his pocket, remembering the automated voice. This number cannot be reached at this time. Remembering the 437 doorbell clips he'd watched 2 weeks ago. Remembering his father standing in a flooded basement, just like this one a dozen times over the years, fixing problems before Glenn even knew they existed. I can't, he said quietly. Simone stared at him. What do you mean you can't just call him? Glenn looked at his wife. She still didn't understand. Didn't understand what had happened on Christmas Eve. Didn't understand that the slap she'd delivered had cost them more than dignity. Didn't understand that my silence, my disappearance, was the consequence she'd never bothered to calculate. He didn't explain. What was there to say that his father had blocked his number? That he'd stood silent on Christmas Eve while she struck an old man across the face? That he'd lost the one person who would have answered this call without hesitation, without charging holiday rates, without making him feel like a failure for not knowing where the shutoff valve was? She said, "Call your dad," as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Perhaps to her it still was. She still didn't understand that I was no longer their family's free utility service, or that my son had lost the ability to reach me the night he stood silent while she slapped me. But the flooded basement was only the beginning of what winter had waiting for them. The note was so old, the ink had faded to brown, and Simone almost threw it away before she recognized the careful handwriting as belonging to the man whose face she'd slapped. Late January. Glenn was at work. No cleaning service scheduled this week. They'd quietly canceled it after the emergency repair bills landed. Simone stood in the kitchen by herself, pulling open drawers looking for a knife that had gone missing. The bottom drawer stuck halfway. She yanked harder, heard something shift behind the track. She reached into the gap, felt around until her fingers closed on a piece of paper folded thin and brittle with age. She pulled it out, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Precise block letters, the kind a carpenter would use to mark measurements on wood. I made chicken soup, left it in pot on stove. Make sure to eat it while it's hot, don't let it get cold. I saw you two got home late last night, you must be tired. No date, no signature, no need, it was so commonplace it didn't require explanation. I learned about the note months later. She'd been looking for a knife, found something else instead. Simone read it twice, then a third time. The paper was yellowed at the edges, soft with age. The kind of note you leave on a Tuesday evening because you noticed your son's car wasn't in the driveway at 10 p.m., and you knew he'd been working late and you wanted to make sure he ate something decent when he finally got home. The kind of note that doesn't get dated. Because it happens so often, there's no reason to mark which particular Tuesday it was. Acts of care that routine don't require authentication. There is a particular cruelty in discovering love only after you've thrown it away, seeing it clearly for the first time in faded ink on yellowed paper unsigned. Because it happened so often, it didn't need a name. Simone stood in the empty kitchen, holding that note for maybe 5 minutes. The house was completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket without telling Glenn. I don't know why she kept it. I only know that she did. 2 weeks later, her credit card declined at the Kroger on Bridge Street. It was a routine grocery run. Sunday afternoon, cart half full with the usual things: milk, bread, chicken breasts, vegetables for the week. Nothing extravagant. Basic groceries for 2 people who both worked full-time and didn't cook elaborate meals. The cashier scanned the last item and read the total. The $148.73. Simone swiped her primary card. The machine beeped. The screen flashed red. Declined. She looked at the screen, confused. Tried again. Same result. Would you like to try another card? The cashier asked, her voice carefully neutral. Simone pulled out the backup card, swiped, waited. Declined. Have you ever stood at a checkout counter watching your card decline and realized the safety net you thought was your own money was actually someone else's sacrifice? Behind her, the line was building. 3 people, then 4. A woman with a toddler. An elderly man with a single bag of apples. A couple in workout clothes checking their phones. Simone opened her wallet, counted the cash. $63. I'll just take these, she said quietly, pointing to the milk, bread, and chicken. Leave the rest. The cashier nodded and began removing items. Vegetables back in the cart. Pasta, cereal, orange juice, coffee. Everything that pushed the total above $63 went back unpurchased, while the line behind her waited and watched. Simone paid with cash and walked out of the store carrying 2 plastic bags instead of 6. For the first time in 10 years, her cards accurately reflected their true balance. No invisible safety net. No mysterious extra cushion appearing every month. Just reality. What she didn't know, what Glenn didn't know either, was that I used to transfer between $800 and $1,200 every month into an intermediate checking account they used for groceries and utilities. Not directly into their main account where they'd notice. Into the buffer account that kept their cards from declining, their checks from bouncing, their comfortable lifestyle running smoothly without them ever having to think about the math. Now the cards showed the truth: they spent more than they earned. They always had. Simone sat in her car in the frozen Kroger parking lot with the engine running for heat. She stared at the declined cards in her hand, then picked up her phone and called her father. Vernon answered on the 3rd ring. "Now, she said. "I need to ask for help." She explained the declined cards, the emergency repairs, the bills stacking up, asked if he could help just to get through the month, just until things evened out. Vernon's voice was measured, not angry, not sympathetic, just flat. "You're both old enough now," he said. "Handle it yourselves." "Dad, we just need help getting through." "That's what you said last time," he interrupted. "And the time before." Figure it out. The line went dead. Simone sat holding the phone. Then she called her mother. Celeste's voice was gentler, but the message was identical. "Darling, you're 38 years old," she said softly. "You have to learn to manage your own finances. We can't keep stepping in." "We're not asking you to keep stepping in," Simone said. "We're asking for help this one time." "You said that last year," Celeste replied. "And the year before. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but your father and I have discussed this. You need to handle it yourselves." She hung up with more warmth than Vernon, but the same finality. Simone sat alone in the cold car, watching her breath fog the windshield. Her parents were wealthy, very wealthy. They could have written a check that would have solved everything without even noticing the money was gone. But they'd never truly helped. They'd only allowed her to believe she didn't need to try. Those are two completely different things. She sat in her car in the frozen parking lot, with half her groceries still at the register, and both her parents' voices echoing in her head. Handle it yourselves. For the first time in 38 years, Simone understood what it felt like to ask for help and be told no. But the declined cards were only the surface. Beneath them lay a mountain of bills no one had been paying attention to. The stack of mail sat unopened on Glenn's kitchen counter for 3 days before he finally opened the first envelope and discovered a question that should have been obvious: who had been paying these bills for the last 10 years. Early February. The envelopes had been piling up since Christmas, accumulating in a neat stack Simone kept meaning to sort through, but never did. Glenn sat down at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with coffee and a letter opener and started working through them. The first envelope had final notice stamped in red across the front. HOA dues. 2 months overdue, $1,200. He stared at it. Tried to remember the last time he'd paid the homeowners association. Couldn't recall ever writing a check to them. Couldn't remember setting up automatic payments. Couldn't remember doing anything at all related to HOA fees in the 10 years they'd lived here. He opened the second envelope. Property tax notice. Franklin County, Dublin, Ohio. January 2023 installment. $4,800. Unpaid. The third envelope, home insurance renewal. Payment lapsed. Coverage suspended pending payment. Glenn spread the bills across the kitchen table like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. Red stamps, bold letters, overdue, final notice, payment required immediately, HOA, property tax, insurance. He said to the empty kitchen, "When did I ever?" He pulled out his laptop, logged into his bank account, searched transaction history going back 3 years, searched for HOA. Nothing. Searched for property tax. Nothing. Searched for insurance payments. Nothing. How many bills in your own life get paid without you noticing? How many systems run smoothly only because someone else is maintaining them in the background while you sleep? I paid them before the letters arrived. Transferred funds to the HOA directly, had the account manager's email sent payment every quarter like clockwork. Drove to the Franklin County tax office twice a year, paid the installments in person so there'd never be a late fee or a lien. Kept his insurance current with the same agent I'd used for 40 years, a man named Ed, who sent me a handwritten Christmas card every December. Glenn never paid these, not once. Someone else always did. He sat at the kitchen table surrounded by red-stamped envelopes doing math in his head. $1,200 for HOA, $4,800 for property tax, estimated insurance renewal around $1,800, $6,000 in bills he'd never known existed, added to the $11,000 in emergency repairs from January, $17,000 in the hole, and it was only February. 2 weeks later, Glenn brought the dog to the vet. It was a Monday morning. He'd taken a personal day from work specifically for this. Bailey's checkup was overdue, and with everything else falling apart, He figured he should probably handle at least one responsibility himself. Dublin Animal Clinic. Bridge Street, same building it had been in for 20 years. Glenn walked in carrying Bailey on a leash, signed in at the front desk, and sat in the waiting room feeling oddly out of place. He'd owned this dog for 6 years. Bought her as a puppy when Simone said she wanted something to take care of something, to make the condo feel like a home. But sitting there in the waiting room, Glenn realized he didn't know her vaccination history. Didn't know when her last visit had been. Didn't even know the vet's name. What does it mean to own a dog for 6 years and never once bring her to the vet yourself? The vet tech called them back. "Bailey Mercer, come on back." Glenn followed her down the hallway into an exam room. Fluorescent lights, stainless steel table, the smell of antiseptic and pet shampoo. Bailey jumped onto the table, tail wagging, completely comfortable in a place Glenn had never seen before. "The doctor will be right in," the tech said, closing the door behind her. Glenn stood there awkwardly, one hand on Bailey's collar, waiting. The door opened a few minutes later. Dr. Sarah Whitmore stepped in, a veterinarian in her early 40s, with the kind, direct manner of someone who'd spent 20 years reading both animals and their owners. She glanced up from Bailey's file with immediate recognition, then confusion. "Where's your father?" she asked. "Otis always brings Bailey right on schedule. Never late, never misses a checkup in 6 years." Glenn's stomach dropped. He's not coming anymore," Glenn said quietly. Dr. Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. "Is everything okay? It's complicated." She nodded like she understood that sometimes complicated was the only explanation people could offer. She set the file down on the counter and opened it. "Well, Bailey's been in great health," she said. "Your father's very thorough. He even writes these notes for me, see?" She turned the file toward Glenn. Pages of handwritten notes. My father's careful block letters. Dates going back 6 years. Every quarterly visit documented. December 2022. Bailey showing slight sensitivity to dry food. Recommend grain-free diet monitor for 2 weeks. September 2022. Energy levels excellent. Weight stable at 47 pounds. Continue current exercise routine. June 2022. Minor ear irritation, likely environmental allergies. Applied treatment schedule, follow-up if symptoms persist. Every visit, every observation, dietary concerns, behavioral patterns, health markers to monitor. 6 years of care documented in handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas notes and yellowed scraps of paper tucked behind kitchen drawers. I'd brought Bailey every 12 weeks since she was a puppy. Religiously. The way you're supposed to when you actually care about something. Dr. Whitmore watched Glenn's face as he read through the notes. "You didn't know he was doing this, did you?" she asked gently. "No," Glenn said. His voice came out hoarse. "I didn't know." She closed the file carefully. "He's a good man, your father. Very devoted. Bailey's lucky to have someone who pays such close attention." Glenn stood there holding his dog's leash, staring at the closed file, understanding for the first time that lucky wasn't the right word. Bailey wasn't lucky. Bailey had been cared for. Consistently. Thoroughly. By someone who showed up every 12 weeks without being asked, without expecting recognition, without needing his son to notice he was doing it. The vet handed Glenn Bailey's file, 6 years of quarterly visits, everyone documented in my careful handwriting. Noting dietary changes, behavioral patterns, health markers to watch. He had owned this dog for 6 years and did not know her vet's name. But I did. And that was only what I discovered by accident. I had no idea yet how much more was still hidden. My son turned 42 on a Tuesday in late February, and for the first time in his entire life, there was no homemade cake waiting on his doorstep when he woke. He told me later, months later, when we could finally speak again, that he sat in his kitchen that night for an hour. 9 o'clock. Simone already asleep upstairs, exhausted from another day of financial stress and declined cards and bills they couldn't pay. The house dark, except for the light above the stove. Glenn sitting alone at the table, staring at the empty counter. No cake, no card. Just empty space where something should be. He couldn't remember when the tradition started. Tried to think back, had there been a first birthday cake? A beginning to this ritual, or had it always just been there, appearing every February like clockwork, like sunrise, like something so natural and inevitable you never thought to question where it came from or how it arrived? Every year. Every single year there was a cake. German chocolate. His favorite. He never asked for it, never requested it, never even acknowledged it, most years beyond a quick text. "Thanks for the cake, Dad." Sometimes not even that. It was just there. A birthday without a cake is just another Tuesday. But a birthday without a father who remembered every single one for 42 years, that's when you realize what alone actually means. Glenn sat in the darkness thinking about all the mornings he'd opened his front door and found that familiar white bakery box sitting on the porch. The card tucked underneath, always handwritten. Always simple. "Happy birthday, son. Proud of you, Dad." 5 words. 6 if you counted the signature. Same message every year with minor variations. Short enough to fit on a standard greeting card. But consistent. Reliable. There. He'd never once thought to ask how it got there. Never wondered what time his father woke to make the delivery. Never considered the cost, not just the $25 or $30 for the cake itself, but the time, the planning, the pre-dawn drive across town to make sure it arrived before Glenn left for work. It was invisible infrastructure like oxygen. You don't think about breathing until suddenly you can't. I'd wake at 5 in the morning. Every year. Set my alarm for 4:45 to give myself time to get dressed. Start the truck, let it warm up in the cold February darkness. Drive to the bakery on Sawmill Road that opened at 5:30, the only one in Dublin that made German chocolate cake the way Glenn liked it. Dark chocolate frosting, extra coconut in the filling. I'd place the order a week in advance. Pick it up at 5:30. Write the card while sitting in the truck in the bakery parking lot, my breath fogging the windows. Drive to his house. Arrive by 6:15. Set the box on his porch. Quiet. No knock, didn't want to wake them. Just set it down and leave. 42 years. I did this 42 times, and he never once asked how. How many invisible traditions run your life? How many things just happen every year that someone makes happen while you sleep? Glenn sat in his dark kitchen on his 42nd birthday, staring at the empty counter, understanding for the first time that traditions don't create themselves. Someone has to wake at 5 a.m. and drive across town in the February cold and remember year after year what flavor of cake you like even when you've never said thank you. No one ever taught my son how to live without a father because I never let him have to learn until now. That same night, in a different house across Dublin, I sat in my garage under warm yellow light. The space heater hummed in the corner. Phyllis had gone to bed an hour earlier. I sat alone at my workbench with a spiral-bound notebook open in front of me, my maintenance log, 412 pages, spanning from 1996 to 2022. Every trip documented, every repair noted. Every morning I arrived before he woke, every problem I solved before it became his problem. I turned to the final page, picked up my pen, wrote the last entry in the same careful block letters I'd been using for 27 years. December 23rd, 2022. Wiped garage floor, salted walkway. Last visit. I closed the notebook, set down the pen. 412 pages. 27 years. Every snow removal. Every furnace check. Every birthday cake. Every veterinary appointment. Every bill paid before the letter arrived. Every quiet arrival and quieter departure. All of it documented, none of it noticed. I pulled a cardboard storage box from the shelf above the workbench, the kind you buy at office supply stores for archiving documents. Set it on the bench. Placed the log inside. Added the folders of receipts organized by year, each one labeled, each expense noted. HOA payments, property tax records, insurance renewals, vet bills, HVAC maintenance receipts, plumbing invoices for work I'd done myself so he wouldn't have to pay a professional. Every invisible dollar spent, every hidden hour invested. I picked up a black marker, wrote on the box lid in large, clear letters, Glenn Mercer, 1996 to 2022. Then I carried the box to the far end of the workbench, knelt down, pushed it into the space underneath, right where Glenn used to keep his toolbox when he was 16, learning to fix things with his hands back when he still came to the garage to work beside me on Saturday mornings, right where only one person would think to look. If he ever came looking, really looking not for help but for truth, he'd find it there. I stood up, dusted off my knees, looked at the empty space on the workbench where the log had sat for the past month, while I'd been adding final entries and organizing records. The work was done, the evidence preserved. The choice was his. I labeled that box with my son's name and tucked it under the workbench, right where he used to keep his toolbox when he was 16, learning to fix things with his hands. If he ever came looking for answers, he'd find them there. I just didn't know how much he'd have to lose first, before he'd think to look. What neither of us knew yet was that March would bring consequences far more devastating than a missing birthday cake. The brown water stain appeared on Glenn's bedroom ceiling 3 days after the March storm, a widening circle of failure that would cost $3,800 and reveal a truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. Early March brought one of those late winter storms Ohio specializes in: mixed sleet and snow, followed by rapid thaw that sent meltwater searching for every weak point in every roof across Dublin. Glenn woke on Thursday morning and saw it immediately, a brown stain on the white ceiling above the bed, roughly 2 feet in diameter, still damp at the edges. He stood there in his bathrobe staring up at it, feeling something close to exhaustion. Not surprise, not panic, just tired recognition that here was another thing, breaking another bill he couldn't pay, another consequence of living without whatever invisible system had been keeping his life from falling apart. He called a roofing contractor, got an appointment for that afternoon. Simone appeared in the bedroom doorway, already dressed for work, coffee mug in hand. She looked at the stain, looked at Glenn. Her face showed nothing. "Add it to the list," she said quietly. Then she closed the door and left for work. The silence between them had become its own language. They communicated now in closed doors and unpaid bills and things left unsaid, because what was there to say? We're drowning. We can't pay our bills. Every week something else breaks, and we have no idea how to fix it, because whoever was fixing it before isn't here anymore. I knew that roof. I'd sealed and repaired it myself over 6 years. Almost finished it completely. Almost. A house doesn't break all at once. It breaks slowly, one corner at a time, in the exact places where invisible hands stopped working. Mike Brennan arrived that afternoon at 2 o'clock, a roofing contractor in his early 50s, with the weathered hands and direct manner of someone who'd spent 30 years reading houses better than their owners did. He climbed down from his truck, carrying a ladder, set it against the side of the building, and scaled up to the roof without saying much beyond hello. Glenn stood in the small yard below, watching the contractor move methodically across the roofline. Brennan walked slowly, examining, occasionally crouching to look more closely at something. He spent 20 minutes up there. When he finally climbed down, he was shaking his head, not in frustration, but in what looked like professional admiration. "See those seals?" Brennan pointed up at various sections of the roof. "That flashing work around the chimney, whoever maintained this house knew exactly what they were doing. Professional-grade repairs, perfectly executed. He walked Glenn around the side of the building, pointing up at different spots. I can see at least 7 different intervention points over the years. See that section there? That's a patch job, but it's done right, proper underlayment, sealed correctly, integrated with the existing shingles so cleanly you'd never know it was a repair unless you were looking for it. And there, all professional work. Glenn stared up at the roof, seeing nothing but gray shingles and trying to understand what the contractor was telling him. How long? He asked. Based on the weathering patterns. Brennan squinted up at the roof. 5, maybe 6 years of consistent maintenance. Someone's been taking care of this place. He pointed to the northwest corner. Only spot they missed was right here. Recent storm damage. That's where your leak is. Shingles lifted in the wind, water got underneath, ran down to your bedroom ceiling. I'd worked on that roof every 18 months since 2017. Sealed every weak point I could find. The northwest corner was scheduled for October 2023. I never got to it. How many times can a stranger recognize your father's work before you realize you never knew what he was doing? Brennan pulled out a tablet, started making notes for the estimate. Glenn watched him work his mind, trying to process what he'd just heard. Professional-grade repairs, 7 intervention points, 5 or 6 years of maintenance. He'd owned this condo for 10 years and never once thought about the roof. Never scheduled an inspection. Never arranged for repairs. Never even looked up at it except in moments like this when water was dripping through the ceiling. But someone had. Someone had been climbing up there regularly, finding problems before they became catastrophes, fixing them quietly, keeping the whole structure sound. Someone who wasn't doing it anymore. Brennan finished his notes and looked up from the tablet. "Stay $3,800, he said. That's to replace the damaged section, reseal the underlayment, match the shingles. I can start next week if the weather holds." Glenn nodded numbly. 3,800. Added to the rest. Then Brennan asked the question, "Who did all this work for you, your maintenance company? Because whoever it was, they were good. Really good. I'd hire them myself." Glenn opened his mouth, closed it, stared at the roof. The contractor waited, expecting a name, a company, a reference. Something. The silence stretched. Glenn's voice came out rough. "I don't know." Brennan's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that looked like understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from seeing a man realize something obvious far too late. "You don't know who maintained your own house." Brennan said it gently, not accusatory, just genuinely puzzled. Glenn shook his head. Brennan looked back up at the roof, then at Glenn, then down at his tablet. "Well," he said after a long moment, "whoever it was, you should probably find out. Because they're not doing it anymore." He folded the estimate sheet and handed it over. "3,800, he said again. Then almost as an afterthought, "But honestly, whoever maintained this for you saved you probably 15 grand over the years in emergency repairs and replacement costs. You should thank them. I stood there holding a bill I couldn't pay for work I never knew was happening. And that was only the roof. I had no idea how much more was about to break." The garage door stopped opening on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, and by Friday evening, my son and his wife had run completely out of words to say to each other. Glenn was late for work that Tuesday. Pressed the button on the garage door opener. Nothing. Pressed it again. The motor made a grinding sound, struggled for maybe 3 seconds, then died completely. He called in sick, called a repair technician, waited 4 hours for the appointment. The technician spent 10 minutes looking at the motor, then delivered the verdict Glenn already knew was coming. "Motor's shot," he said. "Whole assembly needs replacing, 1,400. Glenn signed the work order. Added it to the mental tally he'd been keeping since January. 11,000 in emergency repairs. 3,800 for the roof. $1,400 for the garage door. The numbers kept climbing. Wednesday's mail brought the insurance renewal notice. Glenn opened it at the kitchen counter, still in his work clothes. Read through the summary page. Stopped at the premium amount. Read it again to make sure he wasn't misreading. 23% increase. The explanation was buried in the fine print. Multiple emergency claims filed within 60 days triggered reassessment and penalty rates. The HVAC failure in January. The burst pipe a week later. 2 major claims in rapid succession flagged their account as high risk. Financial collapse is like a building coming down, not all at once, but floor by floor, each failure adding weight to the ones below until the whole structure can't hold anymore. I'd kept that building standing for 10 years, maintained every system, prevented every emergency, kept their insurance rates low by making sure they never had to file claims because I fixed everything before it broke. Now the building was coming down, and every floor that fell made the next collapse inevitable. Friday afternoon, the March credit card statement arrived. Glenn sat at the kitchen table after work and opened all 3 envelopes, laid the statements out side by side, did the math he'd been avoiding for weeks. $38,000. Rolling balance across 3 cards. All of them maxed. Simone came home an hour later, found him sitting there surrounded by papers. She set down her purse, took off her coat, and sat down across from him without saying anything. They both stared at the numbers. Neither spoke. This was the first week in 10 years my son and his wife sat together in total silence. Not because there was nothing to say, because there were no words left that would fix anything. Have you ever sat across from someone you love and realized that every word you could say would only make things worse, so you say nothing at all? They sat like that for 40 minutes. The papers between them told the whole story. $11,400 in emergency repairs from January. $3,800 for the roof repair still pending. $1,400 for the garage door. $6,000 in overdue bills, HOA dues, property tax, lapsed insurance. $38,000 in maxed credit cards. Total exposure roughly $60,600. Combined monthly income after taxes $6,800. The math didn't work. Hadn't worked for months. Probably hadn't worked for years, except someone had been quietly making it work by filling in the gaps they never saw. Both of them knew it now. How did we not see this coming? Simone asked quietly. Her voice had no anger in it, just exhaustion. Glenn looked at the papers, at the bills, at the credit card statements showing years of spending they couldn't actually afford. I think, he said slowly, I think someone was always catching us before we fell. Simone didn't ask who. She already knew. That silence was more terrifying than all the screaming that came before it. Because silence means you've run out of solutions. Late March, past midnight. Simone had gone to bed hours earlier, too exhausted to stay awake, too overwhelmed to sleep well. Glenn sat alone at the kitchen table with one more envelope he'd been avoiding for 3 days. Bank logo in the corner. Official letterhead. Important notice stamped across the front. He opened it. Foreclosure warning. 90 days past due on mortgage payments. Total amount due $8,700. Immediate payment required to avoid foreclosure proceedings. He read through the first 2 pages. Legal language about default and remediation and timelines. Then he reached page 3. Addendum guarantors and co-signers. His own name. Glenn Mercer, primary borrower. Then beneath it, in the same official typeface, Otis Mercer, 2847 Riverside Drive, Dublin, Ohio. Co-signed 2019. Primary residence pledged as additional collateral. Glenn read the line 3 times. His father had co-signed their condo purchase. $580,000. Using his own home, the house Glenn had grown up in, the house his father had lived in for 40 years, as backup collateral. If Glenn defaulted, the bank didn't just take the condo. They went after the guarantor first. They went after his father's house. Glenn set the paper down on the table with hands that had started shaking. He co-signed. He put his own house up. If I lose this place, he loses his. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. For 3 months, Glenn had been worried about losing his condo, his credit rating, his comfortable lifestyle. It had all been about him, his problems, his consequences, his failure. He'd never once thought about who else he might be taking down with him. I don't know how many times my son read that piece of paper. But I know that night, for the first time in his life, he was terrified, not because of money, but because he realized he could destroy the person who had never once harmed him. The father he'd ignored for 3 months. The father whose face had been slapped in his own home while he stood silent. The father who'd blocked his number and refused to answer the door. That father had been standing behind him as a human shield this entire time. My son stared at my name on that foreclosure document until the letters blurred. His hands were shaking. Not because he was about to lose his condo, but because he'd just discovered that if he did, I would lose my home first. By morning, he'd make a decision he'd been avoiding. Since Christmas Eve, he would drive to my house and knock on the door. The sun was barely up when my son's car pulled onto my street, and I watched through the kitchen window as he sat there engine idling for 20 full minutes before he found the courage to get out. I'd been awake since 5. Coffee already brewed. Standing at the sink washing a mug I'd already washed twice just to have something to do with my hands while I watched the street. His car appeared at 6:15. A gray sedan I recognized immediately. He pulled to the curb in front of my house, parked left, the engine running. I didn't go outside. Didn't wave, didn't do anything except stand there at the kitchen window, watching his silhouette through the windshield. I'd seen my son hesitate before, seen him uncertain about decisions, anxious about confrontations, uncomfortable in difficult conversations. But never like this. Never with the weight of knowing what he'd lost. 20 minutes he sat there. I counted. Watched his silhouette lean forward against the steering wheel, head down, shoulders curved in a way that made him look smaller than I remembered. Wondered if he'd drive away. Wondered if I wanted him to. Courage isn't the absence of shame. It's doing the thing that terrifies you even when shame is all you can feel. Finally, the engine stopped. The sudden silence was loud enough that I heard it from inside the house. Then nothing. He sat in the quiet car for another 5 minutes. When he finally opened the car door, it looked like the hardest thing he'd ever done. He stood on the curb, closed the door behind him, stared at my house like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe he'd driven past it 1,000 times over 42 years without really looking at it. The place his father lived, the home he grew up in, the address he knew by heart, but never truly saw. The walk from the curb to my front door is maybe 30 feet. It took him 3 minutes. Every step, visible struggle, hands in his coat pockets, head down. The shuffle of someone walking towards something they're not sure they deserve to reach. I watched him climb the 3 porch steps, stand at the door, raise his hand, lower it, raise it again. Then I heard it, the knock, gentle, uncertain. Not the confident knock of someone expecting to be let in. Not the demanding knock of someone who thinks they're owed entrance. Just a quiet, hesitant sound that barely carried through the wood. That knock was different. Not the knock of someone who expects to be welcomed. The knock of someone who doesn't know if they deserve to be. I crossed the living room, stood at the door for a moment, looked through the small side window. Glenn stood there on my porch, looking older than he had on Christmas Eve. Exhausted, defeated. The kind of tired that comes from carrying weight you can't set down and don't know how to carry. What does forgiveness look like in its first minute? Not reconciliation, not absolution, just making room for someone to stand in your doorway. I opened the door. We looked at each other for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. I didn't hug him. Didn't lecture him about the 3 months of silence or the slap or the bills or the invisible labor or any of the thousand things I could have said. I just stepped aside, making room. That's all forgiveness is in its first second. Not answers, not explanations. Just the physical act of moving your body out of the way so someone else can enter. Glenn hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. Before I tell you what those 30 seconds held, are you still with me? Comment A. If you think I should have made him wait longer, or B. If opening the door was the right choice. Add one reason in 5 to 10 words. Please note what follows includes some recreated details for narrative depth. The lesson is what matters. He stood in the middle of my living room. The same living room where Simone had slapped me 3 months earlier. The same space where Christmas had ended and silence had begun. But it looked different now. Morning light coming through the windows, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, Phyllis's knitting basket on the side table. Everything exactly where it had been on Christmas Eve, but somehow not the same at all. Phyllis appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Glenn, gave him one small nod, then disappeared back into the kitchen, giving us space. She knew what this was. Glenn opened his mouth, closed it. His hands hung at his sides. He looked around the room like he was trying to remember something, or maybe trying to memorize it for the first time. 30 seconds. That's how long we stood there in silence. Longest 30 seconds of my life. Not because I was angry, not because I was waiting for an apology or an explanation or anything specific, but because I didn't know what came next. Didn't know if this silence would break into reconciliation or collapse back into the 3 months of distance we'd been living in. I watched my son stand in my living room, and for the first time I realized something. This was the first time in his entire life he'd come to my house for no other reason than wanting to see my face. Not to ask for money, not to borrow tools, not because I'd invited him for a holiday, or because Phyllis had called to arrange dinner. Not because his furnace broke or his roof leaked or his dog needed a vet appointment. Just to see me, to stand in the same room and breathe the same air and exist in the same space without needing anything except presence. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said and everything we were about to say. Full of 3 months of absence and 42 years of invisible care and one Christmas Eve slap and 27 years of maintenance logs and 437 doorbell camera clips and a foreclosure notice with my name on it. All of it hung there in those 30 seconds. We stood there facing each other. My son in my living room. No words yet. Just breathing the same air for the first time since Christmas Eve. I knew what had to come next, but I needed him to be ready to see it. I didn't say a word, just turned toward the basement door, descended the stairs, and retrieved the box I'd been keeping for exactly this moment. I'd thought about this moment through all of January and February. Rehearsed what I might say when Glenn finally came looking for answers. Imagined the speech I'd give, the explanation I'd offer, the defense I'd mount against all the years of being invisible. In the end, I said nothing at all. I turned away from where he stood in my living room and walked to the basement door. Opened it. My footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs as I descended into the cool darkness below. 5 minutes I was down there. I heard Glenn shifting his weight above me, the old floorboards creaking, probably wondering what I was doing, probably uncertain whether to follow or wait. He waited. I found the box exactly where I'd left it, tucked under the workbench, right where he used to keep his toolbox when he was 16. Pulled it out, dusted off the lid, carried it up the stairs. Glenn was still standing in the living room when I emerged. I walked past him without speaking, carried the box to the dining room table, set it down with deliberate care. The box wasn't large, wasn't heavy. But I knew, and now Glenn knew, that inside it lay 27 years of a man he'd never truly seen. I removed the lid, set it aside, sat down at the table, looked at my son. He walked slowly to the table, stood across from me, stared at the box. I pushed it toward him, waited. Let the silence do what words never could. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Just place the truth on the table and let it speak. Glenn stared at the box for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I saw the question in his eyes, but I didn't answer it. Just nodded once. Permission. He reached forward, removed what was left of the lid I'd already taken off, setting it fully aside. Looked inside. Folders. Manila folders organized by year, labeled in my careful handwriting, each one marked with a year spanning from 1996 to 2022. 27 years. Glenn pulled out the first folder. The label read 1996. He opened it. Inside, receipts from his first apartment. The lease I'd co-signed when his credit wasn't enough. The deposit I'd paid $800 because he didn't have it saved. Utility setup fees I'd covered so he could move in on time. All documented, all dated, all in my handwriting on the payment stubs. He stared at the papers for maybe 30 seconds. Then he looked up at me. His voice came out rough. You kept all of this, every receipt, I said quietly. Every record, 27 years. He pulled out the next folder, 2000. Down payment assistance for his first car, $3,500 I'd transferred into his account and told him was a tax refund. Insurance payments I'd made for the first year because his rates were too high for a 22-year-old with no driving history. Folder after folder. 2005 wedding expenses I'd covered without being asked. The venue deposit when their credit card was declined. The photographer's retainer. The catering balance. 2010 condo down payment. The $18,000 he thought he'd saved himself. Half of it was mine, transferred quietly through an intermediate account so he'd never know. Have you ever seen your own life documented by someone else's sacrifice? Every moment you thought you earned, revealed as a gift you never noticed. Glenn kept reading, kept pulling folders, kept discovering. 2015. Emergency medical bills from Simone's appendicitis. $4,000 in out-of-network charges their insurance denied. I'd paid them directly to the hospital before the collections agency got involved. 2019. The big one. The folder that changed everything. Mortgage co-signing documents. $580,000. My signature next to Glenn's. My home address listed as additional collateral. My property pledged as backup in case my son couldn't pay. Glenn's hands started shaking when he read that page. 2020. Property tax receipts. I'd paid them directly to Franklin County. Twice a year, every year. Never let them become late. Never let my son see a notice. 2021. HOA dues paid quarterly before the bills arrived at his address. 2022. Insurance premiums. Maintenance logs with hundreds of dated entries. Every time I'd shown up at his house before dawn. Every repair I'd made. Every problem I'd solved. All of it documented in the same careful handwriting he was reading now. Glenn didn't speak, just turned pages. I watched him read for 30 minutes. Didn't interrupt. Didn't explain. Didn't defend or justify or apologize. Just watched. Some truths are too large for words. They need documentation, evidence, weight you can hold in your hands. The only sound in the room was paper rustling, folders opening. Glenn's breathing growing heavier as the years accumulated, as the pattern became undeniable, as the scope of what I'd been doing for 27 years settled over him like a weight he couldn't set down. 1996. A young man's first apartment. 2022. A middle-aged man's foreclosure notice. Every year between them, receipts, records, logs, payments, co-signatures, guarantees, invisible arrivals, silent departures. A parallel financial life. I'd lived entirely in service of a son who never knew I was living it. Those papers were speaking for me, saying everything I'd never said out loud in 27 years, saying it better than I ever could have with words. I co-signed your lease. I paid your deposit. I covered your wedding. I guaranteed your mortgage. I maintained your house. I paid your taxes. I showed up in the dark. I fixed what broke. I left before you woke. I never asked for thanks. I never asked you to notice. I just did it. For 27 years, Glenn turned the last page in the 2022 folder, set it down gently on top of all the others. The stack of years spread across my dining room table like evidence at a trial. He didn't raise his head. 30 minutes he'd been reading. 30 minutes of silence, except for the sound of paper and breathing and truth settling into bones. My son didn't raise his head for the entire 30 minutes. I sat there watching him turn page after page after page, 27 years of receipts, logs, payments, silent arrivals, invisible scaffolding. The papers were speaking for me, saying everything I'd held back for decades. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different, and I knew the hardest conversation of our lives was about to begin. He looked up from the papers, met my eyes, and asked the question I'd been waiting 3 months to hear. Why didn't you tell me? I looked back at him for a long moment, considered the question, considered all the answers I could give. Then I said, "Tell you what, which year do you want to start with?" Glenn stared at me. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. What? Which year? I repeated. You've got 27 folders in front of you. Pick one. I'll tell you about it. He looked down at the spread of folders across my dining room table, looked back up at me. I could see him trying to understand whether I was being serious or deflecting or angry. I was being serious. To me, this wasn't about emotion or recognition or gratitude. This was maintenance, documentation, the record of work done. If he wanted to know about it, I'd tell him. But I genuinely didn't understand what he thought I should have told him that the receipts didn't already say. Start with 2014, I said when he didn't answer. Your wedding year. That's a good baseline. Glenn pulled the 2014 folder closer, opened it again even though he'd already read through it once. It was $18,000 for the down payment assistance, I said. You thought you'd saved that yourself. Half of it was mine, transferred through an intermediate account so you wouldn't know. April 12th, $2,400 for the venue deposit when your credit card declined. You don't remember that because I paid it before you ever saw the notice. Honeymoon car rental, $340. Paid in full 2 weeks before your wedding because the company wanted payment up front, and you didn't have it liquid. Glenn's hand started shaking as he held the paper. October 2019. I continued pulling another folder toward me. Your furnace. The burner assembly was caked with carbon. I crawled into that closet at 6 in the morning with a flashlight between my teeth. The smell of old heating oil. The sound of your daughter sleeping in the room right above me. I had the replacement part in my truck because I'd checked the model number 3 months earlier and knew it was coming due. I could see it in my mind as I spoke. The cramped closet, the dirty metal, the careful work of cleaning and replacing parts that would have cost him $4,000 in emergency service if I'd let them fail. You came home that evening and the heat was working fine, I said. You never knew it had almost stopped. Glenn set the paper down. His hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Oh, keep going, I said quietly. 2015, 2016, 2017. You want to know why I didn't tell you? Because there was nothing to tell. This was just what I did. He moved through the folders, 1 year at a time. I watched the pages accumulate on the table in chronological piles. Read folders, unread folders. The evidence of 27 years spreading across my dining room table like an archaeological dig. When his hands shook too much to read, I started reading the entries aloud. June 2017. Replaced son's water heater before failure. 12-year unit showing sediment buildup. Cost $1,840. Simone was home. Told her the city was flushing the water lines and I was there to check for air in the pipes. She believed it. Took me 4 hours. Glenn at work. Never knew. Glenn's breathing had changed. Uneven, shallow. I pulled another page. March 2021. Patched sidewall puncture driver rear tire. Hardware store parking lot. Simone refused my help changing to the spare. Drove away. I followed at a distance. She stopped at the grocery store on Sawmill Road. I fixed the tire in the parking lot while she shopped. 22 minutes. She never knew I was there. Glenn's voice broke when he spoke. I remember that tire. She told me it was free roadside service from the insurance. There was no roadside service, I said. Just me, in a grocery store parking lot, patching a tire so my daughter-in-law wouldn't have an accident on the highway. He counted the pages. I watched him do it. Watched his lips move as he added them up. 400 pages, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe more. 412, I said. I know because I wrote every one. Not one entry contained a complaint. Not one line expressed resentment or frustration or exhaustion. Not one page asked for acknowledgement or thanks or recognition. Just facts, dates, costs, work performed, results achieved. Maintenance logs, that's all they were to me. Documentation of systems maintained, problems solved, failures prevented. Glenn reached the final folder. December 2022, his wedding anniversary month. The Christmas month. The month everything ended. I watched his face as he opened it. Saw him find the final entry. The last line I'd written before I closed the log for good and put it in this box. His hands trembled as he lifted the page. Then he read it aloud, his voice barely functional. December 23rd, 2022. Wipe down son's garage floor before Christmas dinner tomorrow. Bought extra sidewalk salt left bag by door. Temperature dropping tonight. One day before Christmas. The entry ended there. No mention of anticipation. No note about looking forward to seeing him. No expression of hope that this Christmas would be different from the last 26. Just clinical facts about garage floors and sidewalk salt and dropping temperatures. Glenn set the page down carefully. Looked at me. His eyes were red. You were there, he said. The day before Christmas Eve. You were at my house, preparing it. For the dinner where He couldn't finish the sentence. I nodded. I was there. Silence settled over the table. The weight of 412 pages. 27 years. Decades of invisible labor documented in careful handwriting that never once mentioned how any of it made me feel. Glenn's hands flattened on the table. He looked up at me, his voice raw. 400 pages, he said. 27 years. You never wrote a single word about how it made you feel. I met his eyes, held them. Feelings weren't the job, I said. The words hung in the air between us. Feelings weren't the job. Glenn stared at me like I'd just spoken a language he was only beginning to understand. He sat back in his chair. Looked down at the papers spread across my dining room table. 412 pages documenting 27 years of invisible labor, and not one sentence explaining why. Then he looked up again and asked the question one more time. Why didn't you tell me? I looked back at him, met his eyes, considered all the ways I could answer that question, all the explanations I could offer, all the justifications I could mount. Instead, I told him the truth. Because fathers don't keep score, I said. Silence. Long silence. Glenn's face didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. Like a door opening onto a room he didn't know existed. I held his gaze and finished the thought. But sons should notice. Glenn's shoulders curved inward. His breathing changed slower, deeper, like he was trying to steady himself against something heavy settling onto his chest. He bowed his head, didn't speak, just sat there with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed. Not an accusation, not anger, just truth spoken aloud for the first time in 27 years. I watched him process it, watched his shoulders rise and fall with each breath, watched him nod once slowly like he was acknowledging something he'd known all along but had never let himself see. That nod was the first acknowledgement I'd received from my son in 3 months. I let the silence settle. Didn't rush him. Didn't try to soften what I'd said or take it back or explain it away. Just let it sit there between us like the 412 pages of documentation that said the same thing in a different language. Finally, I spoke again. The thing that hurt me most wasn't the slap, I said. My voice was steady, not angry, not shaking, just steady. I'm an old man. A slap won't kill me. I've had worse. Glenn looked up. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. The thing that hurt, I continued, was that you stood right there. You saw it happen, and you chose to say nothing. The memory came back sharp and clear. The sound of Simone's hand meeting my face. The cold December air from the open door. The Christmas lights blinking in the background. The smell of turkey and cinnamon still hanging in the air from dinner. And the absolute quiet from Glenn's corner of the room. Silence is never neutral, I said. When you see something wrong and you say nothing, you've chosen a side. You chose hers. Glenn sat there for a long time. Maybe a full minute. I didn't count. Just watched him sit with that truth, let it work its way through him. Let it settle into the places where he'd been avoiding it for 3 months. Then he spoke. 2 words. You're right. That was all. No explanation. No justification. No attempt to defend himself or minimize what he'd done or explain the impossible position he'd been in. Just, you're right. Sometimes 2 words are enough. Sometimes they're all you need to show you finally understood something that should have been obvious all along. Glenn reached for the last folder. The one labeled 2022. Opened it to the final page. I'd put a summary sheet in there, handwritten in my careful carpenter's script. Not because I needed a tally, I knew the numbers by heart, but because I knew this moment would come eventually. Knew my son would need to see it quantified, written down, made real in a way that receipts alone couldn't convey. Glenn pulled out the page, read the heading, Summary Financial Support, 1996 to 2022. Below it, the breakdown, year by year, category by category. Co-signatures, direct payments, emergency interventions, property maintenance, insurance premiums, tax payments, HOA dues, and at the bottom the total, $70,342, 27 years of financial support. Completely excluding the value of my physical labor. Completely excluding the $320,000 mortgage I'd co-signed using my own home as collateral. Just the cash, the direct transfers, the bills paid before they arrived, the emergencies covered before they became catastrophes, $70,000. Glenn stared at the number. I watched his eyes trace across the page, reading the breakdown, adding it up in his head, even though I'd already done the math for him. He didn't speak, just stared. The number spoke for itself. It said everything I'd never said out loud. Every birthday cake, every property tax payment, every furnace repair, every tire patch, Every dawn arrival and silent departure. $70,000 was the price of being invisible for 27 years. Or maybe it was the price of love when you don't know any other language to speak it in. Glenn looked up from the page, looked at me. His eyes met mine. They were bloodshot, not from crying, from something deeper. The kind of red that comes when a man realizes he's been living a lie for 27 years and the scaffolding just collapsed. When the floor he thought he was standing on turns out to have been held up by someone else's hands the entire time. When everything you thought you built yourself was actually a gift you never noticed receiving. He stared at the $70,000 figure, then at me, then back at the number. I could see the question forming behind those broken eyes, could see it taking shape, could see him trying to figure out how to ask it. The question wasn't why anymore. He knew why now. He understood. The 412 pages had answered that question in a language he finally understood. The question forming behind those bloodshot eyes was different. It was, what do I do now? Glenn's eyes are bloodshot. Not from crying, but from something deeper. The kind of red that comes when a man realizes he's been living a lie for 27 years and the scaffolding just collapsed. He stares at the $70,000 figure, then at his father, and I can see the question forming behind those broken eyes. The question won't be why, he knows why now. It will be, what do I do? I saw the question forming behind those bloodshot eyes. Saw my son trying to figure out what came next. Trying to find the words to ask for a roadmap, a plan, some guidance on how to fix what he'd broken. I stood up, closed the box lid, and placed it into my son's hands. The weight of it settled into his palms. Cardboard and paper. 27 years compressed into something he could carry. He looked down at it, then up at me, confused. I spent 27 years taking care of you, I said. My voice was calm, steady, not angry, just factual. But you let someone slap me in my own home. From now on, go learn how to be a grown man on your own. Glenn's mouth opened. No words came out. He wasn't being kicked out. I wasn't slamming the door in his face or telling him never to come back. I was just releasing him. Letting go of the invisible scaffolding I'd been holding up for 4 decades. Giving him the weight I'd been carrying so he could learn what it felt like to hold it himself. He stood slowly, the box in his hands, looking at me like he was waiting for me to say more, waiting for instructions, waiting for me to tell him what to do next. I didn't. The weight of that cardboard box in Glenn's hands. The sound of his footsteps crossing my living room floor. The particular quality of silence when a son finally understands what his father has been carrying and realizes he's about to carry it himself. Glenn walked to the front door, slowly, each step deliberate. He reached the threshold, stopped, his hand on the doorknob, his back to me, the box tucked under his other arm. He didn't turn around, just stood there for maybe 10 seconds that felt longer. Then he spoke. 3 words. Quiet. Barely loud enough to hear. I'm sorry, Dad. The door opened. Glenn stepped through, and then it closed behind him. Not a slam, not defiance, not anger, just the quiet, mechanical click of a latch catching. A sound so ordinary it shouldn't have meant anything. But somehow that click carried 27 years of invisible labor finally being set down. The sound of a burden I'd been carrying since 1996, finally leaving my house in the hands of the person who should have been carrying it all along. I stood in my living room, listening to his footsteps on the porch. The car door opening, the engine starting, the sound of him driving away, then silence. Complete silence. I walked to the couch, sat down. Stared at the empty dining room table where the folders had been spread just minutes earlier. The weight was gone. For the first time in 27 years, I felt light. Not happy, not relieved, not vindicated, just light. Like I'd been carrying something so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. Phyllis appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd been there the whole time, staying out of sight, giving us the space we needed. Now she came into the living room, carrying 2 mugs of tea, set one on the coffee table in front of me, sat down beside me with the other. She didn't ask what happened. Didn't ask what I'd said to him or what he'd said to me, or whether we'd reconciled or fought or reached some kind of understanding. She just sat there, sipping her tea, being present without needing to fill the silence with words. This was one of the quietest afternoons of my life. Nothing was fully resolved. Glenn still had to figure out what to do with the information in that box. Still had to decide whether to stay with Simone or leave her. Still had to untangle the financial mess that had been building since Christmas. Still had to learn how to live without a father who fixed everything before it broke. But for the first time, I didn't have to carry the resolution by myself. It was his now, his weight, his choice, his life to figure out. I finished my tea, set the mug down, looked at Phyllis. "I'm going to the garage," I said. She nodded, smiled slightly, didn't ask why. I walked out to the garage, turned on the space heater, let it warm the air while I looked around at my tools, my workbench, my wood stock stacked along the wall. I picked up a piece of cherry wood, ran my hand over it, felt the grain beneath my palm, and I started working. Not because someone needed something built, not because there was a problem to solve or a crisis to prevent or a birthday coming up that required a handmade gift, just because I wanted to. For the first time in 27 years, I was working in my garage simply because the work itself brought me peace. Not for Glenn, not for anyone else, just for me. The sound of the plane against wood, the smell of sawdust, the feeling of shaping something with my hands, not because it would fix someone else's problem, but because I wanted to see what it would become. I heard footsteps behind me. Phyllis. She didn't come in, just sat down on the threshold between the garage and the house, watching me work. The same way she used to watch me work when we first met. Back when building things was still just something I did for the joy of it. I didn't look up, didn't need to. I knew she was smiling. I didn't know what Glenn would do with that box. I didn't know if he'd leave Simone, or how he'd untangle 27 years of financial scaffolding, or whether he'd ever truly understand what it cost me to love him in silence. But for the first time in 3 months, that weight wasn't mine to carry. Glenn had the receipts, now he needed a plan. 6 weeks after I handed my son that box, Brent Townsend knocked on my door and told me Glenn was selling the BMW. I'd been in the garage, working on a small table just because I wanted to. Phyllis answered the door, called me in. Brent stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets, the cautious look of someone delivering news they weren't sure how I'd take. "Saw Glenn at the BMW dealership yesterday," Brent said. "Selling it." I nodded, waited. "Looked rough," Brent continued. "The car, I mean, and him. But mostly the car. They gave him a hard time on the trade-in value. I didn't ask how much. Didn't need to. I knew Glenn had overpaid for that car in the first place, and dealerships don't give you back what you spent, they give you what it's worth now." Brent lingered for a moment, then nodded and left. Probably expecting me to say more. Probably wondering if I was satisfied seeing my son forced to sell his status symbols to pay debts he couldn't handle. I wasn't satisfied. I felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that Glenn had needed to lose everything before he could see what he'd been taking for granted. Sad that the lesson couldn't have been learned some other way that didn't involve this much pain. I learned later through the neighborhood network that tracks these things without anyone officially discussing them, that Glenn got $38,000 for the BMW. He'd paid $60,000 3 years earlier. $22,000 loss. Gone in one afternoon. The same day, he and Simone drove to a pre-owned luxury goods shop on High Street. Keith Harmon, the BMW dealership sales manager, had processed Glenn's trade-in with professional sympathy for the loss. Andrea Mills, the clerk at the pre-owned shop, appraised Simone's Chanel bag and Glenn's Rolex with efficient neutrality. $14,000 combined. The Rolex Glenn had bought to celebrate a promotion. The Chanel bag Simone carried to every social event in Dublin for 5 years. All of it liquidated in one day. $52,000 total. Barely enough to clear the maxed credit cards and halt the foreclosure proceedings that were 60 days overdue. Simone's hands gripping that Chanel bag as she walked into the pre-owned shop. No driver waiting at the curb, no assistant to handle the transaction for her. Just Simone carrying the symbol of her old life to the counter herself, and watching a stranger appraise it like any other used handbag. First time in her life, she'd had to handle something difficult without someone else doing it for her. I didn't take satisfaction in that either. Just noticed it. The way you notice when someone finally learns to walk after spending years being carried. May arrived. The neighborhood network reported again. Glenn and Simone were moving. Not to a bigger place. Not to somewhere nicer. To Worthington. A rental house on the west side of town. Modest. Affordable. The kind of place people live when they're building themselves back up from nothing. They rented the moving truck themselves. U-Haul. 24-foot box truck. Glenn drove it. They packed their own boxes, taped them shut with their own hands, loaded their own furniture. The sound of cardboard boxes being taped shut by Glenn's own hands. The particular quality of silence when a man realizes no one is coming to pack his life for him. No moving company, no hired help. Just him and Simone and a pile of boxes that needed to be filled and loaded and unloaded at the other end. I heard through Brent, who heard through someone else, that Simone mowed their new lawn for the first time in her life. Pushed a manual mower across a quarter-acre yard in the May heat. Glenn showed her how. She also shoveled the last of the seasonal snow that hit in late April. Just a few inches, but enough that the driveway needed clearing. She did it herself. Glenn was at work. No one else was coming. The high society friends started vanishing around the same time. They didn't announce it, didn't make a show of it, just stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped including Glenn and Simone in the dinner parties and charity events and weekend gatherings that had filled their Dublin social calendar for 10 years. When people learned they'd moved to Worthington, the invitations dried up completely. Simone texted her closest friend, the one she'd known since college, the one who'd been her maid of honor, the one she'd had lunch with every Thursday for 8 years. No reply. She texted again a week later. Still no reply. Money can't buy loyalty. It can rent the appearance of friendship. But the lease expires the moment the address changes from Dublin to Worthington. I didn't hear any of this directly from Glenn. He didn't call, didn't stop by, didn't send updates or ask for advice or try to explain what he was doing. He just did it, sold the car, sold the luxury items, moved to a place he could afford, started living within the reality of what his actual income could support, instead of the fantasy that invisible scaffolding had been holding up for decades. Phyllis and I drove past the new house once, didn't stop, didn't knock. Just drove by to see where he was living now. Small. Older. Vinyl siding that needed paint. Chain link fence around a yard that needed mowing. 2 bedrooms, maybe 3. Definitely not the Bridge Park condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Scioto River, but it was theirs. Or at least it was rented with money they actually had, rather than money they were borrowing against a future that wasn't coming. Finally, they were living within their own reality. No safety nets, no invisible scaffolding, no father showing up at dawn to fix problems before they became catastrophes, just Glenn and Simone. handling their own difficulties, packing their own boxes, mowing their own lawn, learning what it meant to be adults, without someone else adulting for them. Glenn had sold. The Symbols moved to a house within his means, watched his wife learn to mow grass for the first time. He was living in reality, now handling his own difficulties. But something was still missing, something he'd broken on Christmas Eve that money couldn't fix. The blueprint was still in Simone's office drawer, and the wooden box was still in pieces. Phyllis told me the whole story in July, sitting at my kitchen table over 2 mugs of tea. She had visited Glenn and Simone at the Worthington rental in May, helping them settle in. That was when she witnessed what happened in the garage. Simone was unpacking boxes in that Worthington rental garage, the kind with a bare bulb and oil stains shaped like continents. It was a Thursday afternoon, Glenn at work. She opened the box marked Glenn Childhood, the one Phyllis had packed, because Glenn could not face his own history yet. The blueprint was rolled inside a coffee can. My handwriting on the tube read, "Made for my son's 5th anniversary. Hope they'll use it for many years. Dad, November 2017. Phyllis said Glenn found Simone on the garage floor 3 hours later, still holding it. Not crying anymore, just holding it like evidence at a trial where she was both defendant and jury. That's the entry twist nobody sees coming, not the discovery itself, but realizing Simone never knew I'd built that box with love. She thought it was just furniture. She thought Christmas Eve was about pride, not destroying something I'd made with my hands specifically for them. Glenn told Phyllis that Simone said 6 words, "I broke something that mattered." Not, "I broke something valuable." Mattered. That's when you know someone's actually changed the vocabulary shifts from price to worth. Here's what Glenn didn't tell Simone that day, but told Phyllis 2 weeks later during a supervised visit with the kids. He'd saved every piece of the broken box. Not in the BMW before he sold it. Not in storage. In a Crown Royal bag in his work backpack, carried it every single day since Christmas Eve like a penitent carrying stones. Wood fragments and brass hinges that cost $47 in 2017. He'd been carrying them for 5 months. So in June, they repaired it together. I know this because Glenn took a photo, not to send me, Phyllis said, but because Simone asked him to document it. They used Titebond 3 wood glue, the same brand I'd used originally. Glenn researched it. 41 minutes of YouTube videos on repairing broken joinery. They could have made it perfect, sanded it smooth, refinished it so the breaks disappeared. Glenn's words, according to Phyllis, "Leave them. They belong there." That's the moment I knew my son might actually become a man. Not when he sold the BMW. Not when he moved to the rental. When he chose to leave the scars visible because pretending they never happened would be another lie. The box sits in their living room now. Phyllis saw it in August. The cracks filled with dried glue like gold in Japanese pottery. Kintsugi Simone called it, though she got the philosophy from Instagram, not actual study. But the instinct was right: repair, don't replace. Show the history, don't hide it. Don't hide. What nobody tells you about estrangement is that it runs on silence and fear. Glenn and Simone sat in that rental for weeks, too afraid to call me. Phyllis was our neutral courier, Switzerland in human form. She suggested they ask me themselves. Instead, they wrote 2 vulnerable handwritten letters, sealed them together, and planned to show up unannounced at my annual July 4th barbecue. They resolved to bring the repaired box, face potential rejection, and accept my decision completely. Phyllis told me everything on July 3rd, asking what I would do when they arrived at the gate. Looking at my empty workbench, I told her we would find out tomorrow. But I already knew my answer. I had known since hearing about that Crown Royal bag. On July 4th, 2023, I stood by my grill in Ohio, enjoying my first worry-free Independence Day in 7 years. Phyllis had warned me the day before, but by dawn my decision was clear. The answer was simple. The question was whether the others finally understood. At noon, Brent Townsend arrived with his family bearing a watermelon and a case of Boulevard beer he'd remembered I liked from 2019. That was true friendship. By 2 o'clock, the yard was full of people who simply wanted to be there. At 69, I was finally experiencing life as a guest, rather than the family's structural foundation, shedding 27 years of carrying everyone else's emergencies. The afternoon was perfect, July heat, charcoal smoke, and Springsteen playing nearby. Then around 3 o'clock, instinct made me look past the gate. A dented 2019 Honda Accord was idling. Phyllis stepped silently to my side, always ready for what came next. Glenn and Simone stepped out, dressed plainly stripped of their usual high-status performances. Simone carried the cherrywood box I'd crafted in 2017, the one she had shattered on Christmas Eve. It was repaired now, but the cracks remained entirely visible, filled with dark wood glue. They hadn't tried to erase the damage. They kept the scars. That was the only answer I needed. They waited humbly at the gate, knowing they had to earn back their welcome. "It's your choice," Phyllis whispered. This time they weren't assuming I would automatically support them. My 42-year-old son looked vulnerable, and my daughter-in-law held a broken thing she'd chosen to repair rather than replace. I walked over and unlatched the gate. Glenn looked at me with an honest vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a child. "I didn't fix it to hide the cracks," Simone said, her voice shaking. "I kept them so I would never forget." I nodded, opened the gate wider, and told them, "This time don't walk in like children. Walk in as people who know how to value a family." As they stepped through, the first fireworks cracked open the sky. Boundaries aren't walls. They are the bridges that allow us to rebuild correctly. You cannot repair relationships by pretending they never shattered. I opened that gate not because I forgot the past, but because they finally came to me out of love, not out of need. And to you listening to my story, remember, these boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They're foundations that teach people how to value what they almost lost. Looking back, I spent 27 years being invisible scaffolding. I thought silence was strength, that carrying the weight without complaint was what fathers do. Don't make my mistake. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. The greatest gift you can give someone isn't fixing their problems. It's teaching them to stand on their own. This isn't one of those dad's revenge stories about getting even. Real family justice isn't punishment, it's restoration through truth. When Glenn and Simone stood at my gate with that cracked box, I saw accountability. God teaches us that genuine change shows itself through action, not words. They could have hidden those cracks, but they didn't. They carried the evidence of what they'd destroyed and learned. That's when family justice becomes redemption, not revenge. Dad's revenge stories often focus on payback, but the real victory is watching someone finally understand what they took for granted. I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were standing at that gate? Would you have opened it? Leave a comment below. Your perspective matters. If this story spoke to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wise Revenge for more stories about boundaries, resilience, and second chances. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more than you know. One final note. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for reflection and storytelling. What I hope you take with you is the lesson that sometimes the strongest form of love is knowing when to let go.